In the grand halls of power, crowned heads have made decisions that shaped empires, and others that make you wonder how they remembered to breathe. From kings who lost continents to princes who confused loyalty with lunacy, these are the royals whose blood was blue, but whose judgment was, generously, beige. This isn't history's greatest hits. It's its blooper reel in a velvet cape. Welcome to 25 British royals who were dumbest by nature, a journey through royal blunders so baffling you'll swear they were scripted. Spoiler, they weren't. Before we dive headfirst into this royal parade of poor decisions, make sure you're subscribed. It helps the channel survive more than half these monarchs did. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? We want to know who else is staying up to hear about kings who really should have gone to bed earlier. 1. King George IV. If there was ever a royal whose brain was permanently pickled in brandy and bad decisions, it was George IV. England's walking cautionary tale in ermine. Born into wealth, privilege, and powdered wigs, George didn't just inherit the throne. He inherited the keys to a kingdom he treated like a casino. He wasn't stupid in the classical sense. No, George was something far more British, catastrophically indulgent, elegantly clueless, and aggressively unaware of the world around him. From the moment he could string together a full sentence, George was spending money like it was invented just for him. And in his mind, it probably was. As Prince Regent and later as king, he ran up debts so enormous they made Parliament physically ill. Literally, one MP is reported to have muttered that seeing George's financial statements gave him gout of the soul. That was after George commissioned another diamond-encrusted snuff box, while the country was struggling through post-Napoleonic depression. George spent the national budget like a toddler loose in Versailles. He built the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, a beachside fever dream of domes, dragons, and decor that screamed Eastern fantasy, Western cluelessness. While England faced hunger riots, George imported silk wallpaper and gold-leaf toilet chairs. He was living in a fantasy, and more importantly, he expected everyone else to fund it. But his crowning act of dumbness wasn't just financial, it was emotional. George married a German princess, Caroline of Brunswick, whom he met once, hated instantly, and then locked out of the coronation years later. The ceremony? Grand. The scandal? Grander. George spent more time trying to publicly humiliate his wife than he did reading briefings. At one point, he even tried to introduce a bill of pains and penalties to strip her of her title, because apparently bad husbands make even worse legislators. Historians have tried to explain George IV's behavior as the product of trauma, depression, or the burden of expectation. But that's a very polite way of saying he was pathologically self-centered. He didn't just misunderstand the country he was supposed to govern. He barely acknowledged it existed beyond the garden walls of Carlton House. When farmers were driven from their land, George was busy designing a new coach. When industry workers starved in Manchester, he was ordering custom-made corsets to hide his swelling waistline. The man had a 50-inch chest and a 40-inch waist, but wore outfits tailored for someone half his size. At one point, he commissioned portraits where his face was attached to a younger, thinner body, the 19th century version of Facetune. Vanity wasn't his sin, it was his personality. But here's the thing, for all his buffoonery, Parliament kept bailing him out. Why? Because George, for all his absurdity, still wore the crown. That was the real tragedy. Not just that he was dumb by nature, but that the system allowed him to stay dumb without consequence. The monarchy didn't just tolerate his idiocy, it upholstered it in velvet, hung it with medals, and called it majesty. When George finally died, they buried him with pomp, pageantry, and an unspoken national sigh of relief. His legacy? A monument to what happens when you hand unchecked power to someone whose only real talent is theatrical failure. And yet, George IV wasn't the only royal to mistake personal drama for national duty. Because just a century later, another monarch would prove that sometimes the dumbest move of all is walking away. 2. King Edward VIII. If George IV was the king who couldn't stop spending, Edward VIII was the one who couldn't stop quitting. A man born into royal duty, handed a throne on a velvet cushion, and then, barely 12 months later, tossed it aside like it had the audacity to require effort. The story of Edward VIII is not merely one of romantic defiance. It's a tragic comedy of errors dressed up as a love story, starring a man who thought public service was optional, personal feelings were national policy, and constitutional crisis was just another headline. Let's set the scene. 1936. Edward has just become king after the death of his father, George V, a man so stern and proper that he once described Edward as, "After me, the deluge." And indeed, it was. Edward ascended the throne already deeply entangled with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee with a complicated personal life and a knack for uncomfortable dinner parties. British society was scandalized. The government was alarmed. The Church of England was having an existential meltdown. And Edward? Edward was unmoved. Here was a monarch constitutionally required to embody stability and impartiality, choosing instead to throw the entire British establishment into chaos because, in his words, he couldn't carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love. Romantic? Maybe. Responsible? Absolutely not. This was not a man torn between duty and passion. This was a man who hadn't thought past Act 1, because behind the sweeping rhetoric and tabloid glamour was a ruler woefully unprepared for governance. Edward hated paperwork, ignored ministers, and once skipped a state briefing to go horseback riding. He didn't read memos, he skimmed headlines. Some accounts suggest he preferred giving fashion advice to Wallis over attending Privy Council meetings. Churchill, no stranger to dramatic declarations himself, was reportedly appalled by Edward's shallowness. He thought kingship was dressing well and waving, one aide later said. He was half right. When Wallis's divorce proceedings collided with his coronation planning, Edward proposed a constitutional workaround, make her queen and deal with the backlash later. The government predictably declined. So Edward, in what has been mythologized as the ultimate gesture of love, abdicated. What people forget is that this left Britain, on the eve of World War II, without its monarch, destabilized and embarrassed. It also plunged his brother, the painfully shy and speech-impaired Albert, later George VI, into a role he had neither trained for nor desired. And then there was Edward's post-abdication chapter, which historians have tried very hard to interpret charitably. It's difficult. Edward and Wallis relocated to France, dabbled in high society, and remained politically tone-deaf well into the war years. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, as they were now known, were not merely socialites, they were, in some corners, a diplomatic liability. Edward met with Hitler in 1937, gave what some described as a cordial salute, and toured Nazi Germany with smiles and handshakes. British intelligence grew nervous. Churchill grew furious. Edward claimed it was just protocol. The rest of the world called it something else. After the war, they were quietly exiled to a life of cocktail parties and charitable galas. Edward wrote memoirs full of soft-focus reflections and stunning omissions. Wallis hosted dinners with people who thought Versailles had never ended. The couple lived in elegant alienation, adored by few, tolerated by many, and pitied by more. In the end, Edward didn't just walk away from a throne, he walked away from relevance. To this day, the abdication is still presented as a romantic tragedy. But it wasn't romantic. It was reckless. It was the story of a man who thought love exempted him from responsibility. And that's the heart of it. Edward VIII wasn't foolish because he fell in love. He was foolish because he believed the crown was his to personalize, like a brooch or a bespoke suit. He didn't just misread the room. He misread the country, the Constitution, and the century. And yet, in his gilded self-sabotage, Edward wasn't even the most infamous royal ego of his bloodline. That title belongs to a monarch who didn't just abandon the church. He built an entirely new one out of stubborn lust and violent theatrics. Because if you thought quitting the throne was bold, wait until you meet the king who burned bridges with Rome just to get out of a marriage. And that's only the second royal on the list. If you're already shaking your head, there's plenty more where that came from. So hit that subscribe button. It's free, unlike most of these royal mistakes. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it? Are you doom scrolling in Dublin at 2 a.m. or tuning in from Sydney with your morning tea? We see you, night owls and history addicts alike. 3. King Henry VIII. It's hard to overstate just how many ways Henry VIII managed to baffle, antagonize, and bewilder an entire continent, all while wearing tights. This was a man whose reign wasn't defined by a grand unifying vision or a heroic defense of the realm, but by a series of escalating personal crises dressed up as national policy. If Edward VIII was the royal who walked away, Henry VIII was the one who kicked the door off its hinges, repainted the room in blood red, and asked everyone to applaud. When Henry came to the throne in 1509, he was young, handsome, athletic, the Renaissance poster boy. He spoke several languages, composed music, and wrote theological treatises. For a brief moment, it looked like England might finally get a king with both charm and brains. But brains, as it turned out, are only useful when they're accompanied by judgment. Henry had an insatiable appetite for food, for praise, for war, for women, and an uncanny ability to justify every reckless decision as destiny. The defining moment of Henry's reign, the moment that would unravel centuries of English religious tradition, came not from political necessity, but from romantic frustration. He wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon because she had failed to produce a male heir. The fact that she was his brother's widow and the daughter of powerful Spanish monarchs made things complicated. The fact that the Pope said no made things explosive. So Henry did what any level-headed monarch would do. He broke from the Catholic Church, declared himself head of the Church of England, and made it legally treasonous to disagree, all for the privilege of marrying Anne Boleyn, whom he would later accuse of betrayal and send to the executioner. It was like torching your house to remodel the kitchen, only to get food poisoning from the first meal you cooked in it. The English Reformation didn't start with theological debate. It started because Henry didn't like being told no. He wasn't a reformer. He was a romantic autocrat with trust issues. And the cost was immense. Monasteries were dissolved, libraries destroyed, and centuries-old communities torn apart. Henry looted religious institutions like they were treasure chests, redistributing wealth to loyal nobles who suddenly found themselves landowners of confiscated abbeys. The entire religious fabric of England was ripped and resewn, not by divine revelation, but by royal insecurity. But it wasn't just religion Henry bungled. His foreign policy was equally erratic. Obsessed with martial glory, he launched repeated invasions of France that accomplished almost nothing except draining the royal coffers and giving historians more material for the "What Were You Thinking" files. The Battle of the Spurs? A glorified skirmish. The Field of the Cloth of Gold? A diplomatic costume party with no strategic outcome. His wars achieved so little so expensively that even his own ministers began to subtly suggest maybe we stop trying to reconquer Calais. Then came the marriages, 6 in total, each a blend of diplomatic strategy, hormonal miscalculation, and increasingly desperate attempts at legacy building. There was Catherine, the loyal first wife; Anne, the fiery scandal; Jane, the quiet favorite who died too soon; Anne of Cleves, whom Henry rejected after their first meeting because her portrait was, in his words, too flattering. That's right. Henry invented catfishing. Catherine Howard, the teenage bride surrounded by enemies, and Catherine Parr, the survivor who outlived him, probably by staying silent and reading a lot. To govern under Henry was to navigate a minefield of moods, marriages, and mass firings. Advisors were promoted one day, beheaded the next. Court life became a game of knowing exactly when to flatter and when to disappear. Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, Cardinal Wolsey, men who served him loyally, all eventually discarded when they became inconvenient. Henry ruled like a man who believed being king meant never saying, "That was my fault." Historians have spent centuries trying to rehabilitate Henry as a strong ruler or necessary disruptor, but that's like calling a bull in a china shop a bold interior designer. Yes, he reshaped England, but at what cost and to what end? His pursuit of a male heir led to personal catastrophe, national upheaval, and a succession crisis that would haunt the monarchy for generations. And yet, somehow, Henry still wasn't the most magical thinker to sit on the English throne. Because while Henry was rewriting scripture to suit his love life, another monarch would soon rise who thought witches were behind every misfortune, and who believed hunting them was a righteous science. If Henry was the king who made himself a god, then his successor was the king who tried to become an exorcist. 4. King James VI and I. If you ever wondered what would happen if you gave a paranoid literature nerd absolute power and a crown, look no further than King James VI of Scotland, who later became James I of England, a man who united the crowns of two kingdoms, published one of history's most influential Bible translations, and still somehow found time to write a full-blown witch-hunting manual. Not because witches were a problem, because he genuinely believed magic was real, contagious, and personally out to get him. James came to power at a turning point in history. The Renaissance had started to chip away at superstition. Scientific inquiry was gaining traction. People were beginning to realize that not everything bad was caused by demons, sulfur, or your neighbor's suspiciously fertile cows. James, however, had other ideas. He was convinced, fully and theatrically convinced, that witches were organizing against him. Not metaphorically, literally. Conspiring covens plotting his downfall via storms, curses, and demonic contracts. It all began, as many royal obsessions do, with a wedding. In 1589, James sailed to Denmark to retrieve his bride, Anne of Denmark. Their return voyage to Scotland was plagued by violent storms. Most people would have blamed the weather. James blamed witches, specifically a coven of North Berwick women who, he believed, had conjured the tempests with spells and diabolical sea magic. It was less a logical conclusion and more a historical facepalm. Rather than shrug it off, James leaned in. Hard. He attended the witch trials himself. An unusual move, even for a monarch with control issues. He interrogated suspects personally, supervised torture sessions, and believed wild confessions with such fervor it made his advisors nervous. One woman, under duress, claimed she sailed to sea in a sieve and whispered the storm into being. James nodded, took notes, and added it to the evidence pile. You almost want to admire the commitment, until you remember people died for these absurdities. Then came the literary masterpiece, Demonology, published in 1597. It wasn't just a rambling pamphlet. It was a full philosophical treatise on the dangers of witchcraft and the divine duty to stamp it out. Written in dialogue form, it reads like a Renaissance buddy cop drama, except both cops believe in goblins. The book warned of the cunning ways witches infiltrate society, emphasized the need for harsh punishment, and condemned skepticism as dangerously naive. James wasn't dabbling in folklore. He was shaping national policy through supernatural paranoia. When he became King of England in 1603, James brought his witch obsession south with him. England, which had been somewhat more restrained in its witch trials under Elizabeth, suddenly found itself under the rule of a man who saw demons in droughts and treason in thunderclouds. The Pendle witch trials of 1612, one of the most famous in English history, occurred during his reign, and they bore his fingerprints. Flimsy evidence, dramatic show trials, and a king who considered magic a legitimate threat to his reign. And yet, the irony of James is that while he was terrified of witches, He also fancied himself a modern thinker. He sponsored scholars to translate the Bible, leading to the King James Version, a literary triumph still used today. He patronized Shakespeare. He wrote essays on kingship and governance. But beneath the erudition and rhetoric was a mind riddled with fear, convinced that the invisible forces of evil were never far from the throne. Historians have debated how much of this was true belief versus political theater. Was James genuinely terrified, or did he recognize the political usefulness of a convenient enemy? After all, nothing unites a kingdom quite like a common villain, and witches, being voiceless and conveniently everywhere, made for perfect scapegoats. But the personal detail, the obsessive note-taking, the sermons against sorcery, it all suggests that James wasn't just using the witch trials. He was living them. Even by royal standards, James's magical thinking was a masterclass in imaginative governance. He turned hearsay into doctrine, nightmares into edicts, and personal fear into public policy. His reign shows what happens when the line between superstition and statecraft disappears, when a king mistakes his shadow for a saboteur and orders the world to be afraid with him. And yet, James managed to die peacefully in bed. A rare fate for kings who meddled this much with divine judgment. But the idea he embodied, that a king's belief is truth simply because he believes it, would haunt the monarchy long after his final breath. Especially in the case of his son, who took his father's divine right ideology and ran it straight into a civil war. Because if James believed witches were coming for the crown, Charles I believed no one could take it from him at all. 5. King Charles I. Charles I was a man who mistook silence for loyalty, ceremony for authority, and divine right for actual law. If his father James VI and I was obsessed with witches, Charles was obsessed with the throne, not just sitting on it, but elevating it above every other human institution, including the people who paid for its upkeep. He wasn't the first monarch to believe he'd been chosen by God, but he may have been the last to believe it so literally, so blindly, and so expensively. From the outset, Charles had a problem, namely that he was not very good at talking. He was soft-spoken, stiff, formal, and worst of all for a 17th century monarch, unpopular. Where his father relished public debates and writing pamphlets about demons, Charles preferred divine solitude and absolute control. He didn't want to reason with Parliament. He wanted them to say yes, and then go home quietly. When they didn't, he shut them down. Literally. In 1629, after a series of bitter disputes with Parliament over money, religion, and who actually got to be in charge of things, Charles dissolved the whole body and decided to rule alone. No more back and forth, no more budget debates, no more pesky representatives asking, "How much are you spending on that gold-threaded coronation robe again?" For the next 11 years, known as the personal rule or, more colloquially, the 11 years tyranny, Charles governed without Parliament. It was a bold strategy, and like most bold strategies in British history, it ended in total chaos. Charles raised money through questionable means. He resurrected ancient feudal taxes, fined people for not attending his coronation, and imposed ship money, a tax traditionally collected during wartime, even though there was no war. When landowners protested, he declared their protests illegal. It was less a government and more of a divine improv show, with Charles playing every role except the taxpayer. Then there was religion. Charles and his Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, were staunch supporters of high church Anglicanism, the incense-burning, robe-wearing, bowing and scraping variety that made English Puritans feel like the Pope was peeking through the windows. Charles imposed religious reforms that many saw as a slide back toward Catholicism, and in a deeply Protestant country still traumatized by centuries of religious conflict, that didn't go over well, especially not in Scotland. Scotland, being full of Presbyterians who had no interest in English bishops, exploded in rebellion when Charles tried to impose a new Book of Common Prayer on them in 1637. Churchgoers rioted, ministers walked out, a stool was thrown at a bishop's head, and with that, Charles had managed to start what became the Bishops' Wars. To fund his failing campaign against the Scots, he needed Parliament again. Awkward. So in 1640, he reconvened Parliament and immediately tried to control them, like it was still 1629. Parliament, now older, wiser, and extremely bitter, refused to play along. They demanded reforms. Charles resisted. Tensions escalated. He marched into the House of Commons with armed guards to arrest 5 members, an act so staggeringly tone-deaf that even his supporters cringed. The members had already fled, and Charles, humiliated, muttered that he saw the birds had flown. Indeed, so had his credibility. Within 2 years, England was at war with itself. The English Civil War wasn't just about tax policy or church pews. It was about whether a king could ignore everyone and still expect obedience. Charles believed that his authority came from God. Parliament believed authority came with accountability. The two visions collided, and the battlefield was the result. Even then, Charles doubled down. He refused compromise. He made secret deals. He tried to play his enemies off each other like a royal game of chess, only to find that every pawn he moved turned into a knight on the opposing side. In 1648, after years of war and failed negotiations, Charles was captured. The parliamentarian faction, now led by Oliver Cromwell, had had enough. They put him on trial for treason. Charles refused to recognize the court's authority, insisting he was answerable only to God. The court, in turn, found him guilty anyway. Now, historians have endlessly debated whether Charles was brave, foolish, tragic, or tyrannical. But perhaps the more accurate word is this: delusional. He lived in a fantasy where kings were invincible, laws were optional, and his personal dignity was more important than national unity. It's easy to paint him as a martyr. It's harder to admit he was a man who drove his country into war, not because he was evil, but because he simply couldn't imagine being wrong. And yet, for all his absolutist tendencies, Charles was dethroned by men who believed in something messier: governance by humans with all their flaws. But the fantasy of divine entitlement didn't die with him. It simply retreated, waited, and resurfaced in royal scandals centuries later. Because when monarchy meets self-destruction, it rarely learns. Just ask the Duke of Kent, a man born into 20th century privilege who somehow lived like a Gatsby character with a secret tab at every scandal in London. 6. Prince George, Duke of Kent. In a royal family famous for discretion, Prince George, Duke of Kent, stood out like a martini glass at a temperance rally. He was handsome, dashing, and charming in the way tabloid editors dream about. But he also managed to be one of the most persistently chaotic figures to emerge from the House of Windsor in the 20th century. A man whose public role was ceremonial, but whose private life could have fueled an entire decade of scandal columns. If history had a most likely to make Buckingham Palace reach for the aspirin award, George would have taken it in a landslide. Born in 1902 as the fourth son of King George V, Prince George was never destined for the throne. But what he lacked in constitutional duty, he more than made up for in what polite historians refer to as colorful personal choices. While his siblings were busy projecting royal gravitas, George was living what can only be described as the prequel to a particularly expensive scandal docuseries. Affairs, extravagant parties, private clubs, rumored dalliances, questionable friendships, you name it. And George probably dabbled in it while wearing a tailored tuxedo. He joined the Royal Navy and, to his credit, actually served for a time. But discipline was not his natural habitat. George was frequently distracted by nightlife and indulgence, which tended to get in the way of formal duties like showing up on time or not being in the gossip columns. Eventually, he was transferred to the Foreign Office, possibly because someone thought diplomacy might tame him. It didn't. In fact, by the 1930s, he had managed to become a full-time royal with a part-time attention span and a long list of controversies. There were rumors of wild weekends in society mansions, friendships with avant-garde artists, and late-night calls to cover up personal misadventures. He had a reputation for borrowing money he didn't return, attending parties he shouldn't be seen at, and surrounding himself with people whose idea of discretion was a loud whisper over cocktails. Even his marriage to Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, a union that had all the trappings of royal romance, couldn't entirely rein in his restless spirit. Now, some biographers have attempted to reinterpret George's behavior through a more compassionate lens. Perhaps he was trapped by expectations. Perhaps he was privately struggling with the role he was born into. Perhaps. But also, perhaps he just didn't know when to stop. His lifestyle wasn't merely unconventional. It was chronically unfiltered, drifting from one indulgence to the next with barely a nod to consequence. That might be forgivable for an aristocratic dilettante, but George was a Windsor, a royal brand name, and his behavior constantly teetered on the edge of diplomatic embarrassment. Then there was his role in World War II. In a twist of irony, the man known for escaping duty was brought back into military service, this time with the Royal Air Force. He was given a ceremonial rank, but eventually insisted on more active involvement. It was a strange turn. The prince who had spent much of his adult life avoiding structure was suddenly flying missions and representing the crown in uniform. Whether this was a late-blooming sense of purpose or a royal PR salvage job is still up for debate. What isn't debated is how it ended. In 1942, during the war, Prince George died in a plane crash in Scotland. The official story: the plane went down in poor weather while en route to Iceland. The unofficial lore: that it was all just a little too mysterious. The pilot was off course. The flight plan had changed. The passenger list was incomplete. Conspiracy theories, of course, bloomed like royal roses. Secret missions, classified cargo, and whispered rumors that have never quite gone away. What we know for certain is that the youngest son of George V, the rogue prince of Mayfair knights and military uniforms, was gone, suddenly, dramatically, and still surrounded by questions. Prince George, Duke of Kent, remains one of the monarchy's most compelling enigmas, not because he ruled or reformed or revolutionized anything, but because he perfectly embodied the paradox at the heart of modern royalty. Born to represent tradition, yet endlessly tempted by transgression. His life reads like a cautionary tale told in silk and scandal, the kind of story that whispers through palace halls long after the headlines fade. And yet, even George's tabloid legacy pales beside the next royal on our list. A king whose political instincts were so catastrophically oblivious that he managed to alienate his own country, his parliament, and the entire Protestant majority in record time. Because if George brought chaos with charm, James II brought it with conviction, and a stunning refusal to take a hint. 7. King James II. Every family has that one relative who refuses to read the room. In the case of the British monarchy, that was James II, a man so committed to being out of step with his own kingdom that he somehow managed to get himself dethroned without a proper battle. He didn't just miss the political memo, he set it on fire, rewrote it in Latin, and then accused anyone who disagreed with him of sedition. James wasn't the worst tyrant Britain ever had. He was just stubborn, self-righteous, and spectacularly incapable of recognizing the difference between personal faith and public panic. James ascended the throne in 1685, following the death of his brother Charles II, the famously fun-loving monarch who spent most of his reign flirting with everyone and avoiding war. In contrast, James entered the scene with all the charisma of a sermon and the political instincts of a damp log. He was a devout Catholic in a country that had been deeply Protestant for over a century. Not quietly religious Catholic, publicly, aggressively Catholic, at a time when even a whiff of papal loyalty sent English Protestants into full crisis mode. To be clear, England wasn't just mildly anti-Catholic at the time. It was hardwired into the national identity. The memory of Meritharth's persecutions, the fear of Spanish invasion, the gunpowder plot. All of it had baked Catholicism into the national imagination as both foreign and threatening. And here was James, the new king, attending Mass openly, placing Catholics in high government positions, and issuing declarations of indulgence that allowed religious freedoms. But only if you overlooked the part where Parliament didn't approve them. Now, some of James's defenders argue that he was ahead of his time, a progressive monarch trying to implement religious tolerance. But the issue wasn't the principle, it was the process. James didn't consult anyone, he didn't negotiate. He issued edicts by royal fiat, overriding the checks and balances that had been developing since Magna Carta. To many, it felt less like reform and more like a royal coup dressed up in piety. It didn't help that James also had a serious habit of trusting the wrong people. He surrounded himself with Catholic advisors who had zero understanding of, or interest in, the English political climate. He ignored Protestant counsel, dismissed Parliament repeatedly, and doubled down on every unpopular decision with the confidence of a man who believed he was right simply because he was king. Divine right wasn't just a theory for James, it was his full personality. Then came the real political earthquake. In 1688, James's second wife gave birth to a son, a Catholic son. Until then, the hope among Protestants had been that James's daughter Mary, who was Protestant and married to the Dutch Prince William of Orange, would eventually inherit the throne. But the birth of a male heir meant a Catholic dynasty was now in the cards. Panic ensued. English nobles, already on edge, decided they'd had enough. They sent a discreet invitation to William of Orange to come and rescue the country. William arrived with an army, expecting a confrontation. But James, in a stunning act of royal miscalculation, found himself politically abandoned. His army melted away. His supporters defected. Even his own daughter joined the opposition. It wasn't so much a revolution as a royal eviction. Rather than fight, James fled, first to France, where he was welcomed by Louis XIV, and then into historical infamy. Parliament declared that his flight constituted abdication and invited William and Mary to rule jointly. Thus was born the Glorious Revolution. Glorious mostly because almost no one died and everyone, except James, seemed quite pleased with the outcome. James spent the rest of his life in exile, making weak attempts to reclaim the throne and brooding over how a kingdom could possibly have rejected a king so obviously correct. He had learned nothing. To the end, he insisted that he had been right, that God was on his side, and that the people had betrayed their duty. It was the political equivalent of leaving a job after being fired and still listing yourself as CEO on your resume. The tragedy of James II wasn't that he was malicious. He wasn't. It was that he was utterly, proudly, and unshakably tone-deaf. He mistook conviction for leadership, authority for wisdom, and stubbornness for strength. And in doing so, he accidentally redefined the monarchy forever. But James's fall wasn't the end of royals missing the obvious. Centuries later, another royal would emerge who, despite the benefit of modern media, public support, and every possible warning sign, would still stumble into one public misstep after another. Because sometimes the lesson isn't learned. It's just rebroadcast, one tabloid at a time. 8. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex. It's one thing to be born into royalty. It's another to leave it in a blaze of conflicting interviews, streaming deals, and increasingly vague statements about privacy. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, was once the monarchy's most likable rogue, a cheeky redhead with a tragic backstory, a military uniform, and the rare ability to seem human in a system designed to prevent that. But over time, Harry evolved from national treasure to international headline, all while managing to confuse, divide, and baffle just about everyone, including perhaps himself. Let's begin with the obvious. Being the spare isn't easy. From childhood, Harry was second in line to a spotlight he would never fully own. He wasn't the heir. He was the backup. And like so many backups in history, he spent much of his life trying to figure out whether that made him expendable or liberated. The monarchy, with its deeply entrenched hierarchy and tight-lipped traditions, didn't offer much clarity. So Harry did what many confused royals do. He acted out. There were the early warning signs. The parties, the controversial costumes, a certain ill-advised choice at a fancy dress party still haunts the public consciousness. The nightclub escapades, and a string of tabloid-fueling behavior that screamed, "I'm in pain but also having fun. Maybe." To his credit, Harry served in the military, even undertaking 2 tours in Afghanistan, where he reportedly found more purpose than he ever did at Buckingham Palace. The military gave him structure, anonymity, and a sense of usefulness. 3 things the royal family often forgets to offer its younger members. But when he returned to civilian royal life, the old restlessness resurfaced. Only now, it came with higher stakes. He met Meghan Markle, married her, and within months the pair became both the monarchy's modern hope and its biggest problem. Meghan was everything the institution wasn't prepared for: American, biracial, media-savvy, and unwilling to quietly accept the status quo. Together, they were charismatic, photogenic, and potentially revolutionary. But they were also deeply skeptical of the machinery around them. Then came the Great Royal Exit, or Megxit, if you prefer your constitutional crises with tabloid flair. In 2020, Harry and Meghan announced they were stepping back as senior royals. The world blinked. Buckingham Palace scrambled. No one, it seemed, had a plan. The couple moved to North America, began speaking publicly about the royal family's inner workings, and inked deals with Netflix and Spotify, proving once and for all that the only thing more powerful than royal blood is content. Since then, Harry has published a memoir, Spare, given high-profile interviews, launched legal battles with the British press, and repeatedly criticized the institution that raised him. At times, his grievances have felt legitimate. The monarchy is, after all, famously cold, and Harry's relationship with the British tabloids has been appalling. But at other times, his messaging has landed with the subtlety of a soap opera monologue. The plea for privacy followed by a press tour. The disdain for media attention followed by Netflix cameras. The insistence on healing followed by more public revelations. The contradictions piled up. Supporters see Harry as brave, a man willing to walk away from privilege in the name of mental health and autonomy. Critics see him as hypocritical, someone who wants the benefits of royal fame without the responsibilities. But perhaps the truth is less satisfying. Perhaps Harry, like so many royals before him, is simply a man born into a structure that doesn't allow for nuance, trying to navigate a world that demands it. What makes Harry's saga particularly tragic, and occasionally absurd, is how preventable it all seemed. With better guidance, more empathy, and fewer egos at play, his departure from royal life could have been a dignified reinvention. Instead, it became a rolling drama in which every attempt at control resulted in more chaos. The House of Windsor, so skilled at silence, was utterly unprepared for a prince who wanted to explain everything, and in the process, made things harder to understand. And yet, for all the headlines, the interviews, the documentaries, and the royal riffs, Harry is hardly the first royal to chase a vision of personal freedom at the expense of royal tradition. Nor is he the first to lose sight of the consequences. That honor belongs to a monarch from centuries earlier, whose decisions were so catastrophically ill-judged that they sparked rebellion, rewrote legal history, and ended with him forced to sign a piece of parchment he didn't even understand. Because if Harry walked away from power, King John tripped over it, buried it, and then asked why everything was suddenly on fire. 9. King John. If history were a group photo of English monarchs, King John would be the one awkwardly blinking, standing in the corner, somehow managing to spill tea on his own royal robe. He wasn't just a bad king. He was the bad king, the benchmark, the gold standard of incompetence, the cautionary tale cited in every civics class and every bar fight over the divine right of kings. Even Shakespeare didn't know what to do with him, writing a play that tried to be sympathetic and still accidentally made him look worse. Born in 1166 as the youngest son of the legendary Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, John was never meant to rule, and it showed. His nickname as a child was Lackland, which is what medieval nobles called someone who was both unpromising and inconvenient. Most kids get toys and snacks. John got a lifelong inferiority complex. Still, fate had other plans. After the death of his brother Richard the Lionheart, a king more known for crusades than actual ruling, John inherited the crown in 1199. What followed was a reign of near-constant failure, panic, and poorly timed decisions, all punctuated by one defining characteristic: John's uncanny ability to make enemies faster than he could make sense. His greatest blunder? Losing almost all of England's territory in France. What his father and brother had conquered and secured through decades of warfare and diplomacy, John somehow managed to fumble away in under 5 years. The French king, Philip II, was practically licking his chops. Not because he was some brilliant strategist, but because John was that bad at maintaining control. His military campaigns were disorganized, underfunded, and usually ended in humiliating retreats. One of his nicknames among contemporaries? Soft Sword. That tells you everything. But John's real genius lay in alienating absolutely everyone who could have helped him. He feuded with the church, resulting in England being placed under interdict by the Pope, which meant, among other things, that church services were suspended nationwide. Marriages weren't recognized. Funerals couldn't be held. It was basically a national religious timeout, and it lasted for 6 years. Most kings would have tried to resolve this quickly. John, in classic John fashion, doubled down. He managed to get himself excommunicated, which, even in the Middle Ages, was like getting banned from your own club. He didn't treat his barons much better. John overtaxed the nobility to fund his disastrous wars, fined them for minor infractions, seized their lands, and demanded outrageous fees for inheritance rights. In return, he offered them nothing. No victories, no stability, and certainly no respect. He even allegedly tried to seduce some of their wives, which, while not uncommon in royal circles, is rarely a way to build political alliances. Eventually, the barons had enough. In 1215, they rebelled and forced John to the negotiating table at Runnymede. There, under considerable pressure and the implied threat of civil war, he affixed his seal to a document that would become one of the most famous in world history, the Magna Carta. It wasn't exactly a revolutionary manifesto, more like a list of grievances from fed-up nobles who wanted their money back and some basic rights in return. But symbolically, it was enormous. For the first time, the English monarchy was forced to acknowledge that even kings were subject to the law. John, of course, had no intention of honoring it. As soon as the ink dried, he appealed to the Pope to have the charter annulled, claiming he signed it under duress. Civil war followed. The country collapsed into chaos. The French even got involved. And while John briefly rallied with a few military successes, his reputation was beyond repair. He died in 1216, not in battle, but after a rapid illness, made worse, according to legend, by consuming a surfeit of peaches and too much cider. A fitting end, if apocryphal, overindulgent, poorly timed, and slightly ridiculous. King John's legacy was failure in all directions, militarily, politically, diplomatically. But in a twist of history, his incompetence inadvertently planted the seeds of constitutional government. His forced submission to the Magna Carta gave future generations a blueprint for holding power accountable. He didn't mean to inspire democracy. He just couldn't stop making mistakes long enough to prevent it. But if John's disasters were largely structural, the next monarch's failures were more absent. Because when the kingdom descended into violence again just a few centuries later, it wasn't because the king was tyrannical. It was because he was barely conscious. A ruler whose crown sat on a head that often forgot it even wore one. 10. King Henry VI. If the medieval English crown came with a user manual, King Henry VI never opened it, or more likely he misplaced it under a pile of devotional texts and political memos he forgot to read. Soft-spoken, painfully pious, and chronically indecisive, Henry VI wasn't just unsuited to kingship, he was largely unaware of what kingship required. In a turbulent century marked by war, rebellion, and power-hungry nobles, Henry was less a ruler and more a placeholder, one who periodically forgot he was even in the room. He inherited the throne as a child, not just of England, but of France too, thanks to a brief moment of aggressive ambition by his father, Henry VI. A baby-crowned king of two warring nations sounds impressive until you realize what followed. Decades of regency, political infighting, and a monarchy held together with duct tape and nostalgia. By the time Henry was old enough to rule on his own, the momentum had long since shifted. And he entered adulthood like a sheep accidentally wandering onto a battlefield. While other kings stamped their authority on history through conquests or reforms, Henry VI left behind a legacy of extended silences, missed opportunities, and what can only be described as catastrophic passivity. He had a deep love for learning and religion, founding institutions like Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, which was lovely for future scholars but utterly irrelevant to the barons fighting for control of the realm. Because while Henry was busy endowing chapels and composing prayers, England was unraveling. The 100 Years' War, the long, bloody saga with France, reached its disastrous end under Henry's watch. Territories his father had fought tooth and nail to win were lost, sometimes with barely a fight. The final humiliation came in 1453, when England lost Bordeaux, and with it, its last real hold on French soil. National pride took a dive, the nobility turned on each other, and Henry quietly collapsed. Literally. That same year, the king suffered a complete mental breakdown. For over a year, he reportedly didn't speak, respond, or recognize those around him. He was present in body only, which meant power had to be exercised by proxy. And in medieval England, proxy usually meant ambitious relatives with armies. Enter Richard, Duke of York. The resulting power vacuum set off a chain reaction that would spiral into the Wars of the Roses, one of the bloodiest, most confused civil conflicts in English history. Two branches of the royal Plantagenet family, the houses of Lancaster and York, began a dynastic tug-of-war so violent and convoluted that historians are still piecing together who betrayed whom and why. And in the center of it all stood Henry, the king who couldn't choose a side, even when that side was wearing his own family's colors. His wife, Margaret of Anjou, often had to do the ruling for him. Fierce, political, and ambitious, she led armies in his name and made enemies with ease. But while she fought to preserve the throne for their son, Henry remained eerily detached. His idea of governance leaned heavily on prayer and providence, which might have worked in a monastery, but proved disastrously naive on the battlefield. Henry's reign was interrupted multiple times by Yorkist coups. He was deposed, restored, and deposed again. During his final imprisonment in the Tower of London, he became a spectral figure, still technically king to some, but stripped of all influence. He died there in 1471 under ambiguous circumstances. Officially, it was natural causes. Unofficially, many suspected he had outlived his usefulness to the victors. What made Henry VI's rule so uniquely disastrous wasn't cruelty or ambition, but absence. A slow, drifting failure of leadership that allowed others to fill the void with violence. Where most royal mistakes come from ego or overreach, Henry's came from the opposite. Too much surrender, too much retreat, too little presence in a role that demanded at least some grip on reality. His reign left England exhausted, divided, and traumatized. And yet, incredibly, the monarchy endured. Because just when you think it can't get more dysfunctional, history introduces a queen whose court was even more chaotic, ruled not by kings but by whispers, favorites, and the world's most dangerously influential best friend. 11. Queen Anne. If monarchy were a group project, Queen Anne would be the one who showed up with snacks, forgot her notes, and let everyone else fight over the PowerPoint. Hers was a reign defined not by fierce leadership or grand ambition, but by a kind of passive bewilderment. A quietly tragic tale of a queen caught between shifting allegiances, brutal backroom politics, and an emotional dependency that ended up shaping the entire British government. Anne didn't storm the stage. She stood there while the curtains caught fire. She became queen in 1702, following the death of William III. She was the last of the Stuart monarchs, the last English monarch to veto a bill from Parliament, and the first to preside over a fully united kingdom of Great Britain, a historic accomplishment that, ironically, she didn't exactly engineer herself. Anne's political legacy, like much of her life, was less a result of decisive action and more the fallout of interpersonal chaos, poorly managed court factions, and a cast of friends who wielded power like it was a stage prop. Anne's reign is perhaps best remembered for her famously intense friendship with Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, a woman of dazzling intelligence, sharp political instincts, and an ego big enough to redecorate entire palaces without asking. Sarah wasn't just Anne's friend. She was her confidant, emotional anchor, and political ventriloquist, often speaking on Anne's behalf, writing letters in her name, and pushing her own Whig-aligned agenda with ruthless efficiency. The Queen, by contrast, was shy, frequently ill, and emotionally fragile. She suffered from numerous health problems throughout her life, including gout and obesity, and endured the unimaginable grief of 17 pregnancies, none of which resulted in a surviving heir. That profound personal loss colored her relationships, hardened her religious convictions, and made her increasingly dependent on the few people she trusted. Unfortunately, many of those people were professional manipulators. Sarah Churchill's influence over Anne was so strong that it began to unsettle both Parliament and the broader aristocracy. Decisions about war, military appointments, and party politics seemed to flow not from the crown, but from the Duchess's drawing room. But the danger of being a favorite is that eventually, favorites fall out of favor. And when Anne began to drift toward Abigail Masham, Sarah's poor cousin and political opposite, the court descended into a kind of powdered wig soap opera. Abigail was quiet, devout, and seemingly unambitious, which made her all the more dangerous. Where Sarah stormed rooms, Abigail slipped into them. She became Anne's new confidant, and through her influence, the Queen began to shift away from the Whigs and toward the Tories. This realignment came at a time when Britain was embroiled in the War of the Spanish Succession, a complex European conflict that needed clear-headed diplomacy, not a palace catfight, but that's what it got. The feud between Sarah and Abigail was vicious. Letters were leaked, allegiances were broken. Anne, stuck in the middle, did what she often did. She wilted under pressure. Her indecisiveness wasn't malicious, it was reflexive. Rather than confront problems, she tried to outlast them. She let Parliament tear itself into factions, let ministers rise and fall, and let the emotional weather of her personal relationships dictate matters of state. And yet, despite all this, her reign witnessed critical developments. The union of England and Scotland into Great Britain, the beginnings of the modern two-party system, and the slow but unstoppable shift of power from the monarchy to Parliament. These weren't Anne's victories exactly, but they happened under her watch, while she tried, and often failed, to keep up. When she died in 1714, the monarchy passed to the distant German House of Hanover, bypassing dozens of closer Catholic relatives thanks to the Act of Settlement. Her death marked the end of the Stuarts and the rise of a new era, one that would begin with foreign kings, expanded parliaments, and a whole new set of royal misunderstandings. And speaking of misunderstandings, the next royal in line managed to turn personal rebellion into a political sideshow, wasting fortunes, alienating his family, and proving that sometimes the greatest threat to royal dignity isn't war or scandal, but sheer generational pettiness. 12. Prince Frederick, Prince of Wales. If there were a royal title for most petty human disagreement embodied in a single person, Prince Frederick, Prince of Wales, would have won it without competition, probably while composing a satirical poem about his own father. Frederick was the eldest son of King George II and Queen Caroline, the heir to the throne, and a man so thoroughly at odds with his parents that his life reads less like a royal biography and more like the script to a particularly vicious family sitcom. Only the palace wasn't a soundstage, and the audience was the entire British political class, watching a royal father and son tear each other apart with surgical precision and absolutely no regard for subtlety. Born in 1707 in Hanover, Frederick didn't even set foot in Britain until he was in his 20s. By the time he arrived in London in 1728, his parents had been ruling as king and queen for over a year, without him. They didn't send for him earlier, which may seem like a slight detail, but Frederick never let it go. That resentment would harden into one of the most famously dysfunctional royal relationships in British history. George II thought Frederick was weak, foolish, and pretentious. Frederick thought George II was emotionally cold, politically backwards, and, perhaps worst of all, unfashionable. What began as quiet disappointment quickly escalated into generational warfare. Frederick dedicated much of his life to opposing everything his father supported, purely out of spite. If George II backed a Whig minister, Frederick suddenly became a darling of the Tories. If George II approved a tax, Frederick denounced it as tyranny. Even when their political goals aligned, which they sometimes did, Frederick would find a way to frame himself as a rebellious outsider, the misunderstood prince standing against the crown he was destined to inherit. He fashioned himself as a man of the people, aligning with opposition groups and hosting gatherings filled with dissident thinkers, poets, and dramatists. That would have been noble, perhaps even revolutionary, if it hadn't all been motivated by his pathological need to annoy his dad. His flair for melodrama didn't stop at politics. In 1737, when his wife Augusta went into labor, Frederick committed what may be the most bizarre and ill-judged act of paternal rebellion in modern royal history. He physically removed her from Hampton Court Palace while she was mid-labor, just so his parents wouldn't be present at the birth of their grandchild. He bundled her into a carriage and raced off to St. James's Palace, a move that prompted Queen Caroline to call him the greatest ass in the world. It wasn't hyperbole. Even his hobbies became acts of rebellion. He poured money into cricket, sponsoring matches, and even trying to shape the sport's early rules. He commissioned satirical poems that poked fun at the establishment, poems so transparently self-serving that even his allies cringed. And despite his extensive allowance, he frequently ran up debts with lavish spending on estates, artwork, and political stunts. He treated his role as heir not as preparation for kingship, but as a stage for performance art, one where the punchline was always, "Look at how much better I'd be than my father." Unfortunately, we'll never know if that punchline could have landed. Frederick died in 1751 at the age of 44, predeceasing his father by nearly a decade. He was the first Prince of Wales in British history not to ascend the throne. The cause of death? Likely a pulmonary embolism, though the popular joke at the time was that he died of a burst lung after being hit by a cricket ball. Even his death inspired rumors and mockery. It was a fittingly absurd end for a man whose life had been defined by theatrical defiance. In hindsight, Frederick's story isn't just one of royal foolishness. It's about what happens when succession becomes psychological warfare, when the future king is too busy criticizing the present one to prepare for the job. His life was a masterclass in wasted potential, a blueprint for how to have every opportunity and still be remembered as an asterisk. His legacy passed not to a throne, but to his son, the future George III. who ironically would one day lose something far more valuable than a petty family squabble. Because when it comes to royal blunders, nothing quite compares to a king who, through sheer stubbornness and tragic timing, managed to lose an entire continent. 13. King George III. Of all the royal missteps in British history, few echo louder than King George III's unfortunate claim to fame. He lost America. Not a battle, not a fort, not even just a coastline, an entire continent. 13 colonies, thousands of miles of coastline, and what would later become the most powerful country on earth. That's one way to make the history books. And the tragedy? George wasn't evil. He wasn't a tyrant in the classic sense. He was, more than anything else, committed. Hopelessly, rigidly, catastrophically committed to being right. When George III took the throne in 1760, he was young, well-read, and genuinely wanted to do the job properly. He wasn't flashy. He didn't parade around in powdered wigs writing operas or building seaside palaces. In fact, he was more down-to-earth than many of his predecessors. He married once, stayed faithful, and lived a fairly quiet domestic life with Queen Charlotte. In another timeline, George III would have been remembered as a reformer, maybe even a moderate. But in this one, he became the poster monarch for misjudged imperialism. At first, he seemed promising. He tried to distance himself from corrupt royal advisors. He took an interest in agriculture, earning the nickname Farmer George, which was intended as an insult but now sounds rather endearing. But George had a core flaw, a deep, immovable belief in the divine structure of monarchy. He believed that the king's role wasn't just ceremonial, it was sacred. And when colonies started complaining about taxes and representation, he didn't see political discontent. He saw betrayal. The seeds of the American Revolution were sown in bad timing, worse communication, and a fundamental failure of imagination. Britain, emerging from a series of expensive wars, including the 7 Years' War, decided it was time for the colonies to start pulling their financial weight. Parliament passed a series of taxes, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, none of which were particularly outrageous by imperial standards. But to the colonists, they represented something much bigger. Decisions being made without their consent. No taxation without representation wasn't just a slogan. It was a warning, one that George III promptly ignored. He doubled down. Rather than acknowledging the growing unrest, George supported Parliament in clamping down. He labeled protesters as rebels. He believed any compromise would signal weakness. Even after the Boston Tea Party, when tea, literal tea, was dumped into a harbor in one of history's most British acts of defiance, George still refused to consider a diplomatic path forward. Instead, he endorsed the coercive acts, a series of punitive measures designed to bring the colonies to heel. Spoiler alert, they didn't. War broke out in 1775. By 1776, the colonies declared independence. And while George III didn't personally draft the orders or lead the troops, he remained symbolically at the heart of the conflict. His name was on every declaration. His portrait was burned in every town square. In the American imagination, George III wasn't just the face of Britain. He was the villain. Back home, the war dragged on. It was expensive, demoralizing, and unwinnable. But George remained steadfast, refusing to entertain peace talks or political solutions until it was far too late. Even after key defeats like Saratoga and Yorktown, he kept hoping for a turnaround that never came. Eventually, Parliament, weary, broke, and out of options, negotiated a peace. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 officially ended the war and acknowledged American independence. The British Empire had lost its most valuable overseas possession, and George III had gained a reputation as the monarch who let it slip away. To make matters worse, George's reign didn't end with America. It kept going. and unraveling. He suffered from bouts of mental instability, which would later define the public's image of him just as much as the loss of the colonies. These episodes, now widely believed to have been caused by illness rather than madness, led to a regency in his final years and became the focus of countless historical reassessments, dramatic reimaginings, and speculative diagnoses. But even before his health declined, George III's legacy was already sealed. His rigid, moralistic refusal to adapt in the face of revolution became the cautionary tale of royal inflexibility. He wasn't a tyrant in the mold of ancient emperors. He wasn't cruel or corrupt or gluttonous. He was something far more dangerous, a well-intentioned man who couldn't admit he was wrong. And still, he wasn't the most hopeless idealist of the family line. Because while George lost an empire on principle, another royal would later charge headlong into a doomed rebellion, with bagpipes, misplaced nostalgia, and exactly zero follow-through. A man who believed he could restore a dynasty with charm and kilts alone, because nothing says royal strategy quite like getting Highlanders killed in the name of a ghost. 14. Prince Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie. In the grand theater of royal miscalculations, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, deserves his own act, complete with romantic lighting, tragic music, and a curtain call soaked in delusion. To some, he's the dashing Jacobite hero, the youthful pretender who nearly reclaimed the British throne. To others, he's the aristocratic daydreamer who got thousands of people killed chasing an idea that had already died. Either way, Charles Edward Stuart remains one of the most spectacular examples of royal fantasy colliding with cold reality. Born in exile in 1720, Charles was the grandson of James II, the Catholic king deposed during the Glorious Revolution, and grew up in a world where everyone around him pretended the Stuarts would one day return to power. They sang songs about it. They printed coins for it. They toasted the king over the water at dinner parties. But these weren't plans. They were coping mechanisms. The Jacobite claim to the throne was, by the 1740s, more historical fiction than political movement. But Charles believed it, entirely. Raised in Rome and trained to view himself as the rightful monarch of Britain, he developed a sense of destiny that was unmatched in scale and almost completely detached from strategy. He wasn't a military genius. He wasn't a statesman. He was, however, absurdly confident, devastatingly charming, and fueled by a lethal cocktail of nostalgia and entitlement. In 1745, Charles launched his most infamous endeavor, the Jacobite Rising. He sailed to Scotland with a tiny force, hoping the Highland clans would rally to his banner and that the English people would rise up once they saw their true king. The odds were laughable. Britain was governed by the Hanoverian dynasty, well-established, militarily organized, and deeply skeptical of Catholic restoration. But Charles thought he had God, history, and destiny on his side. To everyone's astonishment, he made early gains. He landed in the Highlands, raised the Stuart standard, and captured Edinburgh with shocking ease. His forces even defeated government troops at the Battle of Prestonpans. By December, they were in England, marching south only a few days' journey from London. It was the high point of the rebellion, and the moment it all started to unravel. Charles assumed the English would rally to his cause. They didn't. He assumed the French would send reinforcements. They didn't. And when his commanders advised retreat, citing supply shortages and dwindling morale, he reluctantly agreed, marking the beginning of a slow, painful collapse. What followed was a long trudge north, diminishing support and growing doubt. The final blow came in April 1746 at the Battle of Culloden. Facing a better-equipped British army led by the Duke of Cumberland, Charles made a series of poor tactical decisions and refused to listen to experienced generals. The result? Total defeat. The Jacobite forces were routed, the Highland uprising crushed, and Charles fled into hiding, disguised as a woman at one point, slipping from cottage to cave with a bounty on his head. The romanticism around his escape became the stuff of legend. Songs, poems, and misty portraits of the prince in exile. But legends are often kinder than reality. The truth is, Charles abandoned his followers, left Scotland in disarray, and never again came close to regaining power. He spent the rest of his life bouncing between European courts, drinking heavily, alienating allies, and growing increasingly bitter. Even his own supporters began to see him not as a hero, but a liability. He fell out with his father, alienated the French, and by the end of his life had become a ghost of the cause he once embodied. The bonny prince of lore had long since vanished, replaced by a graying exile living on past glories and barely managing to keep his dwindling court together. Historians still argue over how serious his intentions were, whether he truly believed he could win or simply wanted to believe it badly enough that the truth didn't matter. But what's undeniable is this. Charles Edward Stuart led thousands into a doomed campaign based on outdated claims, underdeveloped plans, and a profound underestimation of the modern state. And yet, somehow, he's still remembered fondly in song and story. Because nothing sticks like failure wrapped in a good melody. Still, if Charles was deluded by destiny, the next royal on our list was utterly undone by romance and politics. A queen who trusted the wrong man, married the wrong cousin, and ruled with her heart when the moment demanded a spine. Her name was Mary, and her story ended just as tragically, if not more. 15. Mary, Queen of Scots. If Shakespeare had invented Mary, Queen of Scots, critics would have said she was too dramatic to be believable. A teenage queen, a foreign throne, a murder plot, a second husband who may have been the killer, a third husband who was definitely the suspect, and a cousin who eventually had her locked up for nearly 2 decades. Mary's life had all the hallmarks of a political thriller with a main character who, despite everything, could never quite tell a bad idea when she saw one. Born in 1542, Mary became Queen of Scotland when she was just 6 days old. From the start, she was a symbol, a Catholic monarch in a kingdom increasingly pulled toward Protestantism, a royal baby in a political tornado. To protect her from chaos at home, she was sent to France at the age of 5, betrothed to the Dauphin, and raised in the gleaming, backstabbing court of the Valois kings. There, she was pampered, educated, and flattered. She also learned court intrigue. Unfortunately, only the poetic kind, not the practical version that involves survival skills. At 15, she married the young French king, Francis II. At 16, she became Queen of France. At 17, she became a widow. With nowhere else to go and a strong claim to the English throne through her grandmother Margaret Tudor, Mary returned to Scotland, a country she barely knew and a court already wary of her Catholic loyalties and French education. What followed was a reign marked by political missteps, romantic disasters, and a complete inability to read the national room. Her first major mistake? Marrying Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. He was her cousin, her equal in royal blood, and her complete opposite in temperament. Charming, vain, unstable, and ambitious, Darnley quickly became a problem. Mary granted him the title of king consort. But when he demanded more power, she pushed back. Darnley responded by murdering her secretary, David Rizzio, in front of her while she was pregnant. Not exactly a great anniversary gift. Mary forgave him, briefly, then distanced herself, quietly. Then Darnley was found dead, loudly. The house he was staying in exploded, but his body was discovered in the garden, not burned or crushed, but smothered. Whoever killed him hadn't been subtle about it. Suspicion immediately fell on James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a brash, forceful nobleman who had somehow convinced Mary to trust him, perhaps even protect him. A few months later, she married him. The optics? Horrendous. Most of the Scottish nobility were convinced Mary had either been complicit in Darnley's murder or dangerously manipulated by the man who had orchestrated it. Some claimed she was abducted by Bothwell. Others said she ran off willingly. Either way, her political credibility, already on shaky ground, collapsed entirely. The resulting backlash was swift and merciless. The Protestant lords rebelled, captured Mary, and forced her to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI. Bothwell fled into exile. Mary was imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle, where she famously miscarried twins and eventually escaped, only to lose a disastrous battle at Langside. Out of options, Mary fled to England, seeking protection from her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. This would prove to be her final and most consequential error. Elizabeth, understandably nervous about a Catholic rival with a legitimate claim to her throne, promptly had Mary protected in the form of a 19-year house arrest. During those years, Mary plotted, or others plotted on her behalf. The line between active rebellion and being used as a figurehead is blurry, but the result wasn't. In 1586, after the Babington plot, a plan to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne, was uncovered. Mary was tried for treason. She denied everything. She still lost. In 1587, she was executed. Dressed in red, the Catholic color of martyrdom, she met her death with dignity, leaving behind a legend more compelling than her record. In life, Mary had been indecisive, impulsive, and politically naive. But in death, she became an icon, the beautiful, tragic queen who died for her crown. Her son, ironically, would go on to rule both Scotland and England as James VI and I, a political outcome Mary never managed to achieve while alive. Her story is a royal parable in romantic illusions colliding with realpolitik, and the dangers of trusting charisma over competence. Still, as misguided as Mary's judgment may have been, at least she wasn't actively ridiculed by her own contemporaries for seeming, well, a bit dim. That honor goes to a prince whose scandals were less political and more social, and who managed to become the butt of royal jokes even before he died young, confused, and thoroughly misunderstood. 16. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence. In a royal family with centuries of complicated legacies, Prince Albert Victor, affectionately nicknamed Eddie, managed to stand out not for scandalous ambition or tyrannical rule, but for his baffling lack of presence. Not absence, mind you. He was there, in photos, in parades, in the family tree. But intellectually, politically, and in most matters of practical consequence, Albert Victor drifted through his short life with the vague, blinking expression of someone who just walked into the wrong meeting and doesn't know how to leave. Born in 1864 as the eldest son of the future King Edward VII and the grandson of Queen Victoria, Albert Victor was second in line to the British throne. His life should have been one of preparation and statecraft. Instead, it became a case study in royal underperformance, the kind of story whispered behind fans at palace dinners and recorded with gentle exasperation in letters by Victorian courtiers who weren't paid enough to explain things twice. By all accounts, Albert Victor was kind. He was also reportedly pleasant, mild-mannered, and eager to please. The problem, and it was a recurring one, was that he rarely seemed to understand what anyone was talking about. His tutors found him slow to grasp even the basics of classical education, and efforts to train him in military or diplomatic matters were quietly shelved. Rumors swirled that he was intellectually delayed, that he suffered from some undiagnosed cognitive condition, that he simply wasn't all there. Officially, none of this was ever confirmed. But the royal archives make it clear that no one, not even his own parents, seriously considered him fit to rule. As a young man, he was shuffled from school to school, posted on ceremonial military assignments, and eventually sent to Cambridge, where he famously said very little and learned even less. His professors, struggling to teach someone seemingly immune to retention, often resorted to gentle small talk. It's said that one of his tutors remarked, "I don't think he ever realized I was trying to teach him something." Still, he was a prince, and princes are expected to marry. Queen Victoria, ever the dynastic planner, arranged for him to become engaged to Princess Mary of Teck. a bright, serious young woman who, by all accounts, was less than thrilled with the arrangement. Nonetheless, the engagement was announced in 1891. The British public, long skeptical of Albert Victor's abilities, reacted with a collective shrug. And then, just weeks later, Albert Victor fell ill with influenza during an epidemic. Within days, his condition deteriorated rapidly. He died in January 1892 at just 28 years old. The public mourning was real, if subdued. But behind closed doors, the royal family appeared more shaken by the disruption of succession plans than by the personal loss. His fiancée, Mary, would go on to marry his younger brother, the future George V, becoming queen consort and cementing her place in royal history, a role she might never have endured if Albert Victor had lived. Posthumously, Albert Victor's name became a magnet for speculation. Decades later, conspiracy theorists attempted, without serious evidence, to link him to the Jack the Ripper murders. Others painted him as a secret libertine, a man of double lives and dark secrets. But these theories, while colorful, are almost certainly false. The truth is far simpler and arguably sadder. Albert Victor wasn't a monster or a maverick. He was a young man born into enormous expectation and quietly, irrevocably overwhelmed by it. His greatest scandal, if it can be called that, was the quiet consensus that he was not suited for kingship. The nation lost a future monarch, but in losing Albert Victor, it may have also avoided a long and difficult reign defined by confusion, deference, and awkward silences. He remains, in many ways, a royal placeholder, a man who was meant to inherit a crown, but left behind only a question mark. And yet, as passive as Albert Victor may have been, at least he never got anyone spectacularly defeated in battle by insisting on putting friendship above military command. That honor belongs to a monarch who mistook personal loyalty for political strategy and led England to one of its most infamous defeats against an army wielding axes and zero patience for royal favorites. 17. King Edward II. In the long, often questionable legacy of Plantagenet kings, Edward II occupies a strange place. Not the tyrant, not the hero, but something closer to the cautionary fable. He wasn't terrifying. He wasn't brilliant. He was disastrously loyal to the wrong people, hopelessly out of depth, and impressively consistent in making the worst possible decision at the worst possible time. If bad judgment had a face, it might look a lot like Edward, crowned and oblivious, holding a scepter in one hand and a friend's resume in the other. Edward became king in 1307, the son of Edward I, a towering, aggressive monarch known for conquering Wales and nearly subduing Scotland. In contrast, Edward II had different priorities: music, rowing, fashion, and most notoriously, his close male companions, particularly Piers Gaveston. Now, to be clear, favoritism in medieval courts was common. Kings always had inner circles. The issue with Gaveston wasn't that he was close to the king. The issue was that Edward gave him titles, power, and influence far beyond what anyone, including the nobility, thought he deserved. Gaveston, a man of modest birth and a flair for arrogance, was appointed Earl of Cornwall, a title typically reserved for royal blood. The nobles were not amused. He mocked them, dressed extravagantly, and even gave the leading barons insulting nicknames. Edward, meanwhile, ignored every warning sign. Parliament complained. The barons plotted. His father had exiled Gaveston once already, sensing the disaster coming. Edward brought him back and promoted him further. Eventually, the nobles had enough. In 1312, they captured Gaveston and executed him, without royal permission. Edward was devastated, but rather than learning from the fallout, he doubled down. He continued to alienate the barons, appointing a new inner circle of favorites and refusing to reconcile with the increasingly hostile nobility. His stubbornness, combined with a complete inability to manage the court or country, created a kingdom teetering on the edge. Then came the war with Scotland. While his father had fought William Wallace and nearly conquered the northern realm, Edward II inherited the fight and promptly lost it. Spectacularly. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, his army, numerically superior and better equipped, was routed by a smaller Scottish force under Robert the Bruce. It was one of England's most humiliating defeats. The king fled the battlefield. Scottish independence, long suppressed, was effectively secured. The defeat didn't just wound national pride, it further exposed Edward's lack of military skill and deepened the nobility's frustration with his reign. The king, who had inherited one of Europe's most powerful armies, had turned it into a punchline. Even his closest allies began to distance themselves, or worse, openly conspire against him. By the 1320s, the political chaos reached new heights. Edward elevated yet another pair of favorites, Hugh Despencer the Elder and Hugh Despencer the Younger. If Gaveston had offended the nobility with his arrogance, the Despensers took things further, seizing lands, manipulating the courts, and enriching themselves while England's infrastructure crumbled. Rebellions broke out. Edward responded not with reform, but repression, using executions and land seizures to tighten control. It worked temporarily, until it didn't. The final blow came from within his own household. His wife, Isabella of France, tired of being ignored, sidelined, and humiliated, formed an alliance with Roger Mortimer, one of Edward's exiled enemies. In 1326, they invaded England. This wasn't some ragtag rebellion. It was a coordinated strike, welcomed by a population exhausted by incompetence. Edward's support vanished almost overnight. He was captured, forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, Edward III, and imprisoned. The rest of his life was spent in isolation, stripped of power, abandoned by nearly everyone who had once flattered him. His end remains murky, a historical mystery wrapped in rumors and embellished over centuries. What's clear is that his downfall was no coup. It was an inevitability, the result of years of missed warnings, broken alliances, and the belief that loyalty to friends mattered more than competence in leadership. Edward II wasn't hated because he ruled cruelly. He was despised because he ruled blindly. His story isn't just about corruption or favoritism. It's about a king who never understood the job, who mistook personal affection for political ability, and who, even as the walls closed in, kept reaching for the same familiar hands that had built the trap around him. And yet, for all his failures, Edward didn't try to rewrite his image with theatrical grandeur. That would come later. With a king whose obsession with personal majesty was so extreme, he demanded to be treated like a living deity, even as his allies turned against him. Because next came the reign of pageantry over practicality, a monarchy built on mirrors and shattered by its own reflection. 18. King Richard II. If King Richard II had been born into a theater troupe instead of a royal dynasty, things might have gone better. He had the flair, the drama, the wardrobe. What he lacked, tragically and consistently, was the ability to read a political room that wasn't applauding. Richard wasn't stupid in the traditional sense. He was poetic, educated, even eloquent. But he was also dangerously insulated, fatally proud, and so obsessed with the idea of kingship that he forgot how to actually be a king. Crowned at the age of 10 in 1377, Richard inherited a realm already trembling with unrest. The Black Death had decimated the population. The economy was fractured, the nobility was restive, and the general population, no longer willing to bow in quiet desperation, was beginning to question everything, including the crown itself. Richard entered this chaos not as a warrior prince, but as a royal child with advisors pulling the strings. That early period, known as his minority, might have saved him from immediate disaster. But it also laid the groundwork for a lifelong belief that the monarchy wasn't just sacred, it was untouchable. His first major political test came in 1381 with the Peasants' Revolt. The uprising, triggered by crushing taxes and deep resentment, saw thousands march on London under the leadership of Wat Tyler. For a brief and terrifying moment, the monarchy teetered. And then, against all odds, young Richard stepped forward. At just 14, he rode out to meet the rebels, promised reforms, calmed tensions, and convinced many to go home. It was a rare moment of bravery and political instinct, one that earned him temporary respect. And then, just days later, he reneged on every promise, launched brutal reprisals, and reminded everyone that beneath the youthful charm was a mind already sharpening into autocracy. As he matured, Richard began to surround himself with courtiers who flattered his ego and mirrored his belief in divine kingship. He dressed lavishly, demanded elaborate ceremonies, and increasingly isolated himself from traditional forms of counsel. Parliament became an annoyance. The nobility, particularly the Lords Appellant, a group of powerful aristocrats, became enemies. Instead of building coalitions, Richard built a cult of personality. He issued royal decrees without consent, exiled or executed critics, and demanded loyalty not just to the crown, but to his personal image of royal perfection. His downfall, however, didn't come from outside invaders or popular uprising. It came from his own cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, and a man Richard had foolishly underestimated. When John of Gaunt died in 1399, Richard seized his lands instead of passing them to Henry, as custom and law demanded. It was a blatant overreach. Henry, then in exile, returned with a small army, not to claim the throne at first, but to reclaim his inheritance. But Richard had burned too many bridges. Nobles defected, support collapsed, and by the time Richard tried to organize a resistance, it was already too late. He was captured, forced to abdicate, and imprisoned, replaced by Henry IV, the very man he had tried to neutralize. Richard died a year later in captivity under suspicious circumstances. Whether he starved, was murdered, or simply faded away, no one can say for certain. But the aura of divine invincibility he had cultivated so carefully vanished almost overnight. His reign became a cautionary tale, not of tyranny in the conventional sense, but of a monarch so consumed by image, so enthralled by the theater of kingship, that he forgot about the audience entirely. What makes Richard's reign especially tragic is the sense of what might have been. He had intelligence. He had courage in moments. But his deep insecurities, masked by ritual and velvet, turned his court into a hall of mirrors. And in the end, he couldn't tell the difference between his reflection and his reality. Still, Richard didn't invent royal denial. That honor might belong to the next monarch on our list. A king so spectacularly misnamed that history had to give him a corrective nickname, the Unready, not because he was lazy, but because he was perpetually late to every decision that mattered, including how to handle repeated invasions from people who rang the doorbell with flaming ships. 19. King Ethelred the Unready. The worst part about being known as the Unready is that it sounds like you were simply late, as if you'd forgotten to set an alarm or misread a calendar. But in the case of King Ethelred II, the nickname goes far deeper. Derived from the Old English unread, it translates more accurately to poor counsel or ill-advised. So his full regnal name, Ethelred Unread, roughly means noble counsel, no counsel. It's less a pun than an epitaph for a reign so chronically misguided that even 1,000 years later, people are still sighing about it. Ethelred came to the throne in 978 after the suspicious death of his older half-brother, King Edward the Martyr, a royal assassination so shady that half the nobility had theories, and the other half probably had alibis. Ethelred was 10 years old, emotionally unprepared, and immediately surrounded by opportunistic advisors more interested in consolidating their own power than providing anything resembling actual guidance. It didn't help that his mother, Queen Elfrith, was heavily involved in his early reign, and also widely suspected of being involved in Edward's death. Not exactly a comforting start. As Ethelred grew into adulthood, he showed flashes of competence, but never the consistency or confidence needed to handle what was coming. A full-blown Viking resurgence. After decades of relative peace with the Norse world, England under Ethelred entered a period of brutal, frequent, and increasingly organized Viking raids. Not just coastal plunders, but full-scale invasions. The Danes weren't just stealing livestock. They were seizing towns, demanding tribute, and testing how much gold you could extract from a panicked king. Ethelred's response? He paid them to leave. This wasn't a one-time miscalculation. It became policy. In 991, after the Battle of Maldon, a bloody defeat for the English, Ethelred agreed to pay the Danes a massive sum of silver to stop attacking. This payment, known as the Danegeld, was essentially protection money, a royal bribe dressed up as diplomacy. The Danes naturally accepted the silver and then came back the next year for more, and the next, and the next. Ethelred kept paying. Between 991 and 1016, Ethelred authorized no fewer than 13 separate payments to the Vikings, draining the English treasury and setting a precedent that would haunt the realm for generations. The total silver paid could have funded a national army or rebuilt entire towns. Instead, it funded more Viking ships. One chronicler dryly noted, "The more they paid, the more the Danes desired." It turns out if you reward invasion with wealth, it doesn't exactly inspire restraint. To be fair, Ethelred wasn't entirely passive. He occasionally tried to mount resistance. But his military campaigns were erratic, poorly led, and often sabotaged by infighting among his nobles. The king never managed to unite his court, and the country suffered for it. Meanwhile, Viking leaders like Sweyn Forkbeard began launching full-scale conquests, eventually seizing control of entire regions of England. Then came one of Ethelred's most infamous decisions, the St. Brice's Day massacre of Taizon II. In a burst of paranoid nationalism, Ethelred ordered the execution of all Danes living in England, presumably to prevent future invasions. The result was a chaotic, selectively enforced bloodletting that only enraged the Viking world and gave them a moral justification for further retaliation. Sweyn Forkbeard responded by invading with even greater force. England by this point was on the verge of collapse. By 1013, Sweyn had conquered most of the country, and Ethelred was forced into exile in Normandy, a rare moment when a sitting English monarch had to flee the island entirely. He returned briefly after Sweyn's death in 1014, but the writing was already on the wall. He died in 1016, during a final Viking push led by Sweyn's son, Canute the Great, who would go on to become king himself and rule England more effectively than the man he replaced. Ethelred's reign wasn't marked by cruelty, flamboyance, or outright tyranny. It was, in many ways, a lesson in political paralysis. Faced with crisis after crisis, he vacillated, delayed, and chose short-term fixes over structural solutions. He trusted the wrong advisors, underestimated his enemies, and ruled a fractured kingdom with increasingly desperate tools. And yet there's a strange poetry to his legacy. A king undone not by one spectacular error, but by 1,000 hesitant decisions. A monarch who survived not because he adapted, but because he kept finding someone to pay off. Still, for all his dithering and Danegelds, Ethelred never faced the particular problem of being too good at the job. So good, in fact, that the mere question of who would replace him nearly tore the nation apart. Because the next royal on our list was brilliant, admired, and politically sharp. But her refusal to name an heir nearly undid everything she built. 20. Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth I is often remembered as the most iconic monarch in English history. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the woman who reigned alone and redefined power in pearls and poetry. She outmaneuvered assassins, popes, and entire armadas. She cultivated an image so luminous and calculated that her face became immortalized on coins, canvases, and the national psyche. But behind all the symbolism and pageantry was one of the most quietly dangerous royal flaws imaginable: an absolute refusal to name a successor. It wasn't indecision in the usual sense. Elizabeth could make decisions. She just didn't like sharing power, especially not with anyone who might outshine her, now or later. The throne to her wasn't just a duty. It was an identity, a mythos she crafted with surgical precision. And like all good myths, it required a controlled ending, or preferably, no ending at all. She came to power in 1558, after a childhood defined by instability and survival. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed when Elizabeth was 2. She'd been declared illegitimate, reinstated, threatened, imprisoned, and used as a political pawn in a game that killed most of its players. By the time she put on the crown, Elizabeth understood one thing better than anyone else. Power is never stable, and heirs are threats long before they ever inherit. So, she never named one. In an age obsessed with succession, this was borderline reckless. The 16th century was still fresh from decades of bloody religious turmoil, civil unrest, and disputed claims to the throne. Elizabeth's predecessor, Mary I, had spent her reign persecuting Protestants and trying to produce a Catholic heir. Before her, Edward VI had tried to rewrite the succession entirely, and before him, Henry VIII had created an entirely new church just to manage his own. The Tudor line was a fire hazard already. Elizabeth just added a new match. Throughout her 44-year reign, Parliament pleaded with her to marry. She didn't. Foreign suitors came and went, princes, dukes, even her own former brother-in-law, Philip II of Spain. But Elizabeth kept them all at arm's length. At court, she flirted, teased, and weaponized her singleness like a geopolitical bargaining chip. She understood that as long as she was unwed and heirless, she was the central player on the European stage. Everyone needed her. No one could plan for what came next. But the longer she delayed the issue of succession, the more unstable things became. Factions formed. Ambitious nobles circled. Catholics backed Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin and rival claimant to the throne, whose mere existence became a rallying cry for plots, rebellions, and European interference. Elizabeth eventually had Mary executed in 1587, a decision she agonized over but ultimately couldn't avoid. It removed a threat, but not the uncertainty. By the late 1590s, Elizabeth was aging. Her once youthful image, curated through paintings that made her look eternally 30, no longer matched the reality. She lost trusted advisors. Her court grew more fractious. Still, she refused to name an heir. Naming one meant accelerating her own irrelevance. It meant admitting there would be an England without her. And that was not a future she was willing to entertain. Eventually, everyone just started guessing. Most eyes turned to James VI of Scotland, the Protestant son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and a man whose lineage made him a logical, if politically awkward, choice. Elizabeth neither confirmed nor denied. When she died in 1603, she left behind no formal declaration, no official succession plan, just a crown and a long trail of careful ambiguity. Fortunately for the country, James had the right allies and moved quickly. He became James I of England with relative ease. But it could have gone very differently. Elizabeth had played a masterful game of image, diplomacy, and power. But her greatest failure, the one that historians often gloss over in favor of Armada glory, was that she left the realm hanging by a thread. The irony? She ruled longer than any Tudor, secured the Protestant future of England, and oversaw an unprecedented cultural golden age. And still, she nearly destabilized it all by refusing to let go. But if Elizabeth's refusal to plan for the future was rooted in pride, the next royal on our list bungled the present in real time, turning the British Army into a museum of outdated weapons, lost causes, and missed opportunities. Because, as it turns out, being in charge of military reform requires you to believe reform is real. 21. Prince George, Duke of Cambridge. If history teaches us anything, it's that giving a man absolute control over an army he doesn't understand, and then letting him keep that job for nearly 4 decades, is a bit like handing the keys of a steam train to someone who still thinks horses are the future. Enter Prince George, Duke of Cambridge, first cousin to Queen Victoria, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army from 1856 to 1895, and the human embodiment of the phrase, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it, and if it is broke, just salute louder." Born in 1819 to Prince Adolphus, Duke of Cambridge, George was royal through and through. He was educated, bred for public service, and destined for high rank not because of any particular talent, but because of the invisible escalator of aristocratic entitlement. His military career began in the usual aristocratic fashion: ceremonial postings, rapid promotions, and the quiet understanding that being royal meant never having to explain your qualifications. In 1856, at the age of 37, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, a position he would occupy for longer than many monarchs sit on thrones. What followed was one of the most astonishingly static eras in British military history. While the rest of the world marched forward, embracing new technologies, adopting new doctrines, and rethinking what warfare would look like in the age of industrialization, the Duke of Cambridge remained steadfast in his commitment to, well, mostly tradition and instinct. He famously resisted nearly every reform proposal that crossed his desk, blocking modernization efforts with the stubbornness of a man who once figured out how to wear a sword sideways and never forgot the achievement. Under his leadership, the British Army continued to operate with Napoleonic-era structure well into the late 19th century. He resisted the introduction of short-service enlistment, which would have allowed the creation of a large reserve force. He opposed the expansion of staff colleges, because training officers was apparently too radical, and he dismissed merit-based promotions as unnecessary tampering. The Duke believed that British soldiers needed character, not credentials. Strategy, he felt, was less about planning and more about inherited instinct, something gentlemen simply had. It didn't help that George had a deep, almost spiritual attachment to ceremony. He adored uniforms. He attended endless parades. He cherished cavalry, even as the rest of the world realized horses weren't bulletproof. To him, the idea of change wasn't just threatening, it was unpatriotic. When asked about reforms proposed by figures like Edward Cardwell, the then Secretary of State for War, the Duke of Cambridge once famously snapped, "There is a tendency to regard the British soldier as a machine. I object to this view." Which sounds noble, until you realize the machine he objected to was training. His resistance to reform grew so notorious that he became the bane of military modernizers across the political spectrum. Critics whispered that the army was being crippled by a corset of gold braid. The Army List, a document showing ranks and appointments, looked more like a social register than a battle plan. By the 1880s, Britain's military capacity was lagging behind those of other major powers, particularly Prussia, whose methodical, staff-based system was light years ahead. To be fair, George wasn't malicious. He was deeply patriotic. He cared about his men. He genuinely wanted the army to function, just as long as it functioned exactly the same way it had when he was 20. But history doesn't wait for sentiment, and by the 1890s, even Queen Victoria had lost patience. In 1895, after 39 years in office, George was finally forced into retirement as part of a wider effort to drag the army, kicking and screaming, into the modern world. His legacy? A long, gilded period of military inertia. His defenders called him loyal. His critics called him a fossil. Both were probably right. In the end, George, Duke of Cambridge, wasn't a tyrant or a failure in the dramatic sense. He was something more dangerous to a country on the verge of a new century. an immovable object. But while George's rigidity slowed an institution, the next royal on our list took mismanagement to an entirely new level, governing a kingdom not with tradition, but with tone-deaf obsession. Because when your country is falling apart, and you respond by building castles and composing music, something has gone deeply, operatically wrong. 22. King Henry VI of Scotland, aka James III. History has a way of mistaking eccentricity for madness, and in the case of King James III of Scotland, it didn't need to work very hard. A monarch who seemed only marginally interested in the actual business of ruling, James is remembered not for epic wars or sweeping reforms, but for his relentless, almost childlike fascination with music, art, architecture, and a complete lack of understanding that a king's hobbies are not, in fact, national policy. Born in 1451 and crowned in 1460, after the untimely death of his father, James II, the young king inherited a Scotland torn by noble rivalries and long-simmering instability. He also inherited a throne that required careful diplomacy and firm leadership, neither of which were ever spotted in James's immediate vicinity. From an early age, he showed a strong interest in music, sculpture, and lavish decoration, and a near-total disinterest in military affairs, economic planning, or, crucially, listening to his advisors. James wasn't just fond of the arts. He was obsessed with them. He surrounded himself with foreign musicians, architects, and astrologers, often ignoring the powerful Scottish lords who expected to hold courtly influence. This may not sound like a crisis, but in 15th century Scotland, snubbing the nobility was a dangerous game, one James insisted on playing, even as his allies dwindled and resentment mounted like scaffolding on one of his many unfinished building projects. He spent royal funds, which were limited, to put it kindly, on cathedrals, ornate palace expansions, and collecting relics. Meanwhile, the economy suffered. Clan rivalries spiraled out of control. Lawlessness spread across the highlands and borders. But James's gaze remained fixed on carvings and songbooks. If there was trouble, he preferred to build around it. Literally. Even his choice of friends was baffling. He showed favor to low-born courtiers and foreigners, elevating them above established nobles. One of his closest confidants was an architect named William Rogers, an Englishman whom James treated with near-royal status. This infuriated the Scottish nobility. To them, it wasn't just favoritism, it was betrayal. A king who preferred masons to marquesses wasn't just eccentric, he was threatening the feudal order. The nobles responded the way medieval nobles often did, with open revolt. In 1482, James's own brother, Alexander, Duke of Albany, led an English-backed invasion into Scotland. Rather than rally his forces, James fled to Edinburgh Castle and essentially waited it out. He was captured by rebel lords, imprisoned briefly, and then reinstated under humiliating conditions. His authority was so hollow at this point that he couldn't even secure the release of his favorite musicians, who had also been arrested during the uprising. And still, he didn't change. His final years were marked by increasing isolation. His relationship with the nobility never recovered, and his own son, the future James IV, was drawn into yet another rebellion against him. In 1488, at the Battle of Sauchiburn, James III rode out with loyalist forces against an army that included his teenage son. He was killed during or shortly after the battle, under murky circumstances, either slain in the fighting or quietly dispatched while trying to escape. The details remain debated. The result does not. Scotland traded one James for another and breathed a collective sigh of strategic relief. James III's legacy is that of a king who ruled as if reality were optional. He wasn't violent or cruel. He simply couldn't grasp the difference between private passion and public duty. While castles crumbled and alliances failed, he hummed to himself and corrected the angle of a stained glass window. And yet, Even James never struck a secret deal with a foreign king behind his own parliament's back. That particular brand of royal carelessness would belong to a man who loved indulgence, mistresses, and French money, and whose reign turned the Restoration into a punchline. 23. King Charles II. For a monarch brought back from exile in a blaze of public celebration, King Charles II spent much of his reign proving just how fast you could turn a second chance into a slow-motion scandal. Known to history as the Merry Monarch, Charles wasn't so much merry as he was selectively interested, deeply invested in wine, women, and witty conversation, but largely allergic to fiscal responsibility, military planning, or anything resembling a long-term strategy. If his father, Charles I, died believing in divine right, Charles II lived as if divine indulgence were the whole point. Restored to the throne in 1660 after more than a decade of Republican rule under Oliver Cromwell, Charles II was hailed as a symbol of national healing. The Civil War was over. The monarchy was back. Parliament had been mollified. Hopes were high. And Charles, tall, charming, fluent in irony, seemed just the man for the job. For about 5 minutes. From the start, Charles treated kingship like a balancing act between theater and damage control. He had spent most of his youth in exile, bouncing between European courts, and had absorbed the habits of a man who knew how to keep various factions just happy enough to avoid mutiny. But while he understood survival, he had little interest in reform. Government was a performance. Religion was a negotiation. War was something you tried to delegate, and if all else failed, you could always borrow money and hope no one asked too many questions. He revived the court in full flamboyant splendor, hosting endless masques, balls, and banquets. The royal mistresses were not a footnote. They were part of the brand. Charles openly flaunted his affairs, fathered at least a dozen illegitimate children, and bestowed titles like party favors. His official mistress, Barbara Villiers, was given a duchy. Nell Gwynn, a former actress, was famously kept in royal apartments. When someone mistook her for a Catholic during a riot, she shouted, "Good people, I am the Protestant whore," a quote that tells you more about Charles's reign than any policy document ever could. But beneath the frivolity was a monarch who made decisions that undermined his own government. Most notably, in 1670, Charles signed the secret Treaty of Dover with Louis XIV of France. In exchange for subsidies, Charles agreed to support France in its wars and, even more controversially, promised to convert to Catholicism when the time was right. This was treasonous, not legally, but morally. A Protestant king striking a covert deal with a Catholic monarch while lying to his own parliament. The subsidy allowed Charles to avoid calling Parliament for funds, which in turn allowed him to sidestep uncomfortable questions like, "Are we still technically allies with France?" Or, "Why do you need so many new ships?" The result was a monarchy that drifted, seduced, and schemed its way through one of the most politically volatile periods in British history. Charles's wars against the Dutch were poorly managed and frequently ended in humiliation. The Great Plague and the Great Fire of London both occurred on his watch, and while he handled them with relative calm, the disasters underscored a reign that often felt reactive rather than visionary. And yet, somehow, he remained popular. His charm, his informality, and his refusal to lecture anyone about morality made him oddly beloved, even as the nation grew more divided. By the time of his death in 1685, Charles had left behind no legitimate heir, a mountain of debt, and a brother, James II, who would inherit the crown and immediately make everything worse. Charles II's legacy is complicated. A monarch who understood people but misunderstood power, who kept his throne by entertaining everyone and trusting almost no one. He didn't fall. He faded into velvet, perfume, and a long list of unfinished problems. But if Charles used charm as a distraction, the next royal on our list never even had the chance. A young prince raised like a Fabergé egg in a glass box, pampered, protected, and fatally overindulged, whose short life became a footnote in how not to raise a future monarch. 24. Prince William, Duke of Gloucester. Every royal family has its cautionary tale, the glittering child with all the promise and none of the preparation. For the House of Stuart, that child was Prince William, Duke of Gloucester. The only surviving child of Princess Anne and her husband Prince George of Denmark, William was more than just a royal son. He was, quite literally, the fragile bridge between dynasties. The only viable Protestant heir standing between the English throne and another full-blown succession crisis. But instead of being raised to rule, he was raised like a fragile heirloom, displayed, overprotected, and catastrophically under-challenged. Born in 1689, William entered the world during a time of immense political paranoia. His uncle-in-law, King William III, and aunt, Queen Mary II, had only recently deposed his Catholic grandfather, James II, during the Glorious Revolution. With Protestant legitimacy hanging by a thread, young William was treated as the next great hope of the new order. His very existence was seen as political insurance. The only problem? He was hardly allowed to be a child, let alone a future king. From infancy, William was plagued by poor health, chronic fevers, developmental delays, and mysterious seizures. His caretakers, instead of encouraging resilience, adopted a strategy of radical indulgence. His education was stop-start, dictated by his moods. Tutors came and went, many dismissed for expecting too much from the boy or for introducing ideas deemed too rigorous. He was frequently showered with praise, shielded from failure, and handled with such caution that even minor challenges were considered dangerous. The result? A child who remained intellectually and emotionally underdeveloped, despite being physically coddled like a national treasure. When his cousin, King William III, tried to engage him in conversation, he was reportedly unimpressed by the boy's lack of curiosity. Court observers began whispering that William, charming and sweet though he may have been, was not remotely prepared for leadership. And with each passing year it became increasingly clear that the Stuart plan for succession was built on a foundation of worryingly soft sand. In 1700, just shy of his 11th birthday, William fell seriously ill, some say with smallpox, others suspect hydrocephalus or other neurological conditions. Whatever the cause, he died within days. His mother, Princess Anne, was devastated. Politically, the kingdom was thrown into a quiet panic. The last viable Protestant heir of the Stuart line was gone. Parliament, in desperation, passed the Act of Settlement in 1701, bringing in the Hanoverian dynasty as the next best Protestant option. William's short life is rarely given much attention, overshadowed by more dramatic reigns. But in many ways, he represents the silent failure of royal parenting, a child meant to save a dynasty, raised with such overprotection and under-expectation that he never had the chance to become more than a symbol. The tragedy wasn't just that he died young. It's that, even if he had lived, no one seemed to be preparing him for the storm he was supposed to inherit. And yet, as much as William was a victim of others' decisions, the next royal walked willingly into irrelevance, a cardinal prince who abandoned the cause his entire family had bled for, and then spent the rest of his life in silk robes, praying for a future he actively avoided. 25. Henry Benedict Stuart, Cardinal King Henry. If ever there was a royal whose life felt like the epilogue to someone else's story, it was Henry Benedict Stuart, known to history as the Cardinal Duke of York, and to die-hard Jacobites as King Henry IX. The younger brother of Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie himself, Henry was born in 1725 into a family that had already lost everything. The Stuarts had been dethroned, exiled, and increasingly romanticized, not as real rulers, but as tragic relics. Henry's life would be defined by that same strange twilight, noble titles, grand illusions, and absolutely no power. Where his brother Charles burned bright and fast with rebellion and disaster, Henry took another route entirely, one marked by restraint, piety, and quiet abandonment. While Charles led the Jacobite uprising of 1745, Henry chose the church. At 22, he was made a cardinal by Pope Benedict XIV. It was a deeply symbolic gesture, a royal heir turning away from secular power, embracing the robes of Rome instead of the sword. To the Vatican, it was a political statement. To Jacobites, it was a betrayal dressed in cassock. After the catastrophic failure at Culloden, Henry's choice began to look suspiciously like wisdom. Charles descended into drinking, paranoia, and irrelevance, while Henry rose steadily through the ecclesiastical ranks. He became one of the wealthiest churchmen in Europe, living comfortably in Rome, surrounded by art, music, and a curated sense of faded grandeur. But that comfort came at a price: the complete severing of any practical claim to the British throne. When Charles died in 1788, childless and broken, Henry became the final male heir of the Stuart line. Jacobites, now more mythologists than monarchists, half-heartedly recognized him as King Henry IX. But even they understood the futility. Henry never pressed his claim. He made no speeches, no declarations. He did not travel to Britain or rally support. Instead, he remained a Catholic cardinal, bound by vows, uninterested in power, and perfectly content to let the movement that birthed him drift into folklore. In a way, Henry's abdication of ambition was as radical as any rebellion. He didn't fight to reclaim his family's crown. He buried it under ceremony and liturgy. To his supporters, it was a dismal surrender. To his detractors, it was long overdue. But to Henry himself, it seems to have been peace. He died in 1807 at the age of 82, a remarkably long life for a man whose entire dynasty had burned itself out by the time he was a teenager. His tomb, commissioned by none other than Pope Pius VII, sits in St. Peter's Basilica. It calls him King Henry IX of England. Not many people notice, and thus ended the Jacobite dream. Not with a battlefield or a revolution or even a royal decree, but with a quiet cardinal in a velvet chair, sipping wine and watching the world move on without him.